It happened in seconds, but the ripple shook the monarchy. Young Prince George, always calm and composed, suddenly rose before the royal press, cutting through whispers and tradition to defend his sister in a moment that left even King Charles in shock. No one expected drama at what was meant to be a polished celebration, a royal charity event radiating with grace, legacy, and unity. The entire royal cast was there. King Charles presiding with regal authority, Queen Camilla at his side, William and Catherine dignified as ever, and the younger royals standing tall, learning the posture and presence expected of the crown. But beneath the sheen of diamonds and diplomatic smiles, a quiet storm was brewing, one that would leave its mark not only on that day but on the legacy of the Windsors themselves. Camilla's grandson, increasingly spotlighted at such events, had slowly been introduced to the public as more than just extended family. Quiet murmurs among insiders suggested he was being positioned for something greater: roles, responsibilities, and attention usually reserved for those of royal blood. And while the public hadn't been given the full picture, those within palace walls knew that the push was intentional. Whispers circled among courtiers. Camilla's influence was growing bolder, and Charlotte, whose lineage ran deep through Windsor history, often found herself quietly maneuvered aside. Behind closed doors, during a brief intermission at the charity gala, a confrontation unfolded, one that no adult had witnessed directly but that echoed with undeniable weight. Camilla's grandson reportedly made a comment, a cutting, cruel remark aimed at Charlotte. It was meant to belittle, to provoke. What was said exactly remained a mystery, as Charlotte never repeated it word for word. But what followed spoke volumes. She withdrew into silence. Her shoulders stiffened. And while Camilla stood nearby, she did not intervene. Not then, not after. Just silence. George, standing nearby, caught the final words. He saw his sister's face, read the sting behind her composed mask. He watched Camilla glance away, and that was enough. In that split second, everything shifted inside him. The weight of protocol vanished. The heir's composure cracked just enough to let something more powerful through righteous fury. As the cameras clicked and dignitaries gathered for the final photo op, George did the unthinkable. He stepped away from the formation. His shoes echoed on the marble floor as he walked straight to the mic. Confusion swept through the room. William looked up sharply. Catherine's breath hitched. Camilla froze. And before the press could be ushered out or the mic cut, George spoke. Clear, controlled, but burning with fire. She's my sister, and I won't let anyone treat her like that. What followed was silence, thick and breathless. No child of the monarchy had ever defied the script so publicly. Then came chaos. Aides scrambling, flashbulbs snapping, advisors whispering into phones. It wasn't just a statement, it was a signal. The balance of power had just shifted. And while many dismissed it as a childish outburst, those who knew the royal game understood. Something irreversible had begun. But what George didn't know was that this one act of courage would unravel years of hidden resentment, power games, and buried secrets across the monarchy. This wasn't just a sibling defense, it was the first crack in a carefully guarded royal facade. What the public never saw was the simmering divide between the blood royals and Camilla's rising lineage. For years, the palace had kept a tight lid on its evolving inner dynamics, allowing the public to see only the polished surface of unity, heritage, and harmony. But behind the velvet curtains and ceremonial protocol, there was an undeniable shift occurring. Camilla's grandson, young, charismatic, and increasingly visible, had been quietly stepping into spaces traditionally reserved for those with royal blood. He was never officially declared a working royal, yet his presence at major events and his proximity to the throne told another story. He was being groomed not by accident, but by design. And those who noticed were told to stay quiet. One of the first to notice the shift was Catherine. She saw the pattern forming in subtle but deliberate ways: an extra seat at a press event that had once been Charlotte's, a photo op that omitted her daughter but included Camilla's family, royal memorabilia distributed with selective images that erased Charlotte's presence altogether. The world might have dismissed it as oversight. Catherine knew better. This wasn't an oversight. This was strategy. And it wasn't hers. For Charlotte, it was never about the spotlight. Raised with the discipline of duty, and the elegance of restraint, she had always fulfilled her role with dignity. But the signals became harder to ignore. Camilla's quiet hand behind seating charts, her influence over which photos were released to the press, even whispers about which heirloom jewelry pieces were made available to the women of the family, all pointed to one truth. Camilla was redrawing the lines of prominence, and Charlotte was being slowly, deliberately moved out of frame. George saw it too, not just as a brother, but as a boy expected to one day lead a kingdom. He watched the favoritism play out with growing unease. At first, he stayed silent, believing that the adults would correct it. But months passed, and the pattern only deepened. He saw his sister's grace, her silence, her quiet sacrifices. He saw her shrink from moments she once embraced. It made something inside him simmer, a protective instinct, sharpened by confusion, then anger. That outburst at the charity event wasn't a lapse in judgment. It was a culmination of quiet agony. George had reached his limit not just as a brother, but as the future face of a family that was becoming unrecognizable. His words may have shocked the room, but their roots ran deep through months of watching his sister be sidelined, diminished, overlooked. And while the public gasped at his defiance, the senior courtiers behind the scenes felt something else: panic. This wasn't just about protocol anymore. This was a direct challenge to the invisible hand that had been reshaping the monarchy's image. Leaks, divisions, rivalries, these were the ghosts the palace had worked tirelessly to hide. Now, thanks to one protective brother and the mistreatment of a young princess, those ghosts were stirring again. And the royal household knew that if they didn't contain the storm, the entire illusion of unity could collapse. But what the palace failed to predict was how the public would respond, and how Charlotte herself would break her silence in the most unexpected way. While the palace scrambled to do damage control, Charlotte stepped forward with a quiet but devastating statement that made headlines around the globe. And this time, she wasn't holding back. No cameras, no grand stage, just ink, paper, and purpose. While the institution twisted itself into knots trying to minimize the fallout from George's public defiance, Charlotte did what no one anticipated. She made her voice heard. Not through a rehearsed speech or orchestrated appearance, but through something far more powerful: a handwritten letter. Addressed to her school and shared discreetly with select members of the press, it was just a few lines long. But every word cut through generations of royal silence like a blade through silk. "I know who I am. I know what my grandmother wanted for me." That was all it said. Nothing more. And yet it was everything. The note stunned even the most hardened royal correspondents, because in those simple lines lay layered defiance, heartbreak, and an undeniable awareness of her own place within the monarchy's legacy. It wasn't just a child defending herself. It was a young royal declaring that she would no longer be erased. The press seized on her words immediately. Analysts pored over the phrasing, "what my grandmother wanted for me," wondering aloud if it hinted at private instructions, whispered promises from Queen Elizabeth herself. Was this the Queen's unspoken wish breaking through the silence of her own institution, or was it Charlotte rewriting her story away from the shadows she'd been pushed into? The headlines poured in within hours. The Times called it "The Princess's Stand." The Guardian asked, "Is the Crown listening?" Social media detonated in a frenzy of solidarity. Hashtags like "Stand with Charlotte" and "She is Windsor" trended across continents. Young girls across the world reposted her words with admiration. Even seasoned commentators, used to towing the palace line, couldn't hide their awe. The resemblance to Diana, brave, unfiltered, emotionally raw, was impossible to ignore. And this time, it wasn't history repeating itself. It was history demanding to be seen. Inside the palace, the atmosphere turned icy. Camilla, sources said, was devastated. She hadn't spoken to anyone outside her inner circle in days. Her grandson's ill-timed arrogance had triggered something much deeper. For years, she had built her power on subtlety, on never stepping too far into the frame. But now, the very children she once underestimated were rewriting the frame itself. And for the first time, she found herself on the outside looking in. Charlotte's note didn't just clear the air, it electrified it. What was once quiet tension had become open defiance. And this wasn't the last word. It was the first. Because while the press celebrated her courage and the public chose sides, something even more earth-shattering was already stirring beneath the surface. Something no one, especially Camilla, was prepared for. As the public rallied behind the young princess, an old document long sealed in the Windsor vaults was about to be brought into the spotlight. Buried deep within the royal vaults, a letter from Queen Elizabeth unseen by most finally surfaced. Its contents? A direct message to Princess Charlotte that would turn everything upside down. The discovery was no accident. In the chaos following George's bold defense and Charlotte's quiet declaration of independence, the palace was on edge, grasping for clarity in a house now divided. But clarity came not from Charles or Camilla, nor from William or the advisors desperately crafting statements. It came from someone who had watched quietly from the sidelines all her life, Princess Anne, the late Queen's most loyal confidant. With firm hands and a heavy heart, Anne walked into Kensington Palace and placed a sealed envelope in Catherine's hands. It bore no formal markings, no instruction beyond a familiar handwritten phrase, "For her eyes, when the moment is right." Inside was something more powerful than any public decree, a private promise from Queen Elizabeth to her great-granddaughter. It had been written shortly before the monarch's passing, dictated with clarity and signed with a trembling but deliberate hand. The contents weren't laced with titles or thrones. They didn't speak of power. They spoke of purpose, of inheritance not in jewels, but in responsibility, of legacy not as entitlement, but as calling. "One day, the world will see you as I do," the Queen had written. "Not because of where you were born, but because of who you choose to become." Catherine wept silently as she read the letter aloud to William. There were references to Diana, subtle, but unmistakable, of how courage was sometimes born in quiet hearts, of how the women who changed the monarchy did so not with commands, but with conscience. Charlotte, the Queen wrote, possessed that same flame, the kind that could light the future if protected and if not dimmed by jealousy, politics, or tradition. In that moment, Catherine and William understood something that had long been hidden from them. Elizabeth had seen Charlotte's quiet resilience, her watchful eyes, and had whispered a destiny not yet written in official record, but carved into the soul of the monarchy. But word of the letter did not stay private for long. When Camilla learned of its contents and of Anne's role in delivering it, rage overtook her calm exterior. She accused the family of keeping secrets, of manipulating legacies to sideline her bloodline. But no amount of protest could erase the weight of the Queen's words. And while Camilla tried to reassert control behind closed doors, it was William who began to rethink the very foundation of what the monarchy should stand for. For months, he had tried to balance loyalty and diplomacy. Now, that balance was breaking. He looked at his daughter with new eyes, not just as a child of the crown, but as its future guardian. Someone worthy not because of her position, but because of her heart. The palace had long mistaken quiet for weakness. But now, that quiet was becoming a roar, and Elizabeth's final blessing had turned the tide. But nothing prepared them for what came next. Camilla's grandson, cornered by public backlash, made a move that sent tremors through the royal household. Desperate to salvage his image, Camilla's grandson granted a surprise interview. But instead of sympathy, his words ignited a wildfire the palace couldn't contain. The interview was neither scheduled nor sanctioned. It was a last-minute arrangement with a lifestyle outlet known more for celebrity puff pieces than political fallout. And yet, within minutes of the clip being posted, it had become the epicenter of a storm the monarchy could no longer avoid. He smiled too much. He shrugged too often. And his words meant to smooth tensions reeked of arrogance and entitlement. "It was just a joke," he said, brushing off his comments to Charlotte. "She's always been a bit sensitive." That one sentence would become the nail in his own public coffin. Viewers recoiled. Commentators, once sympathetic to his presence in royal circles, turned sharply. The smirk, the condescension, the implication that Charlotte had overreacted. It all played like a masterclass in what not to say. Within hours, social media exploded. "Keep Charlotte safe" trended across platforms. So did "royal blood first," a phrase that reignited the debate about Camilla's lineage, her family's place in royal affairs, and whether certain boundaries had finally been crossed. Memes, petitions, editorials, every corner of the internet took a stance. And for once, they were unified. The public stood firmly behind Charlotte. Inside the palace, the damage was immediate. Catherine, usually the picture of composure, was seen at a children's charity event the next morning, her smile forced and eyes heavy with quiet fury. She said little, but her silence spoke volumes. The press caught every angle, every glance. William, by contrast, remained completely out of sight. Advisors begged him to release a statement, but he refused. It wasn't indecision, it was strategy. Silence, in this case, was louder than words. And the longer the palace failed to speak, the more the people did it for them. King Charles was left in an impossible position. Family loyalty pulled him in one direction, public outrage in the other. He had worked for years to preserve the image of a modern monarchy. But now, that image was cracking under the weight of his own wife's grandson. And with every headline that favored Charlotte and vilified the boy, the pressure to act mounted. It wasn't just a scandal. It was a test of allegiance. Then came the moment that confirmed what insiders had feared. The frost had gone from private to public. At Windsor's spring gathering, where the royal family traditionally posed for warm, inclusive photographs, George was spotted refusing to stand near Camilla's grandson. In a single frame, he turned away, chin lifted, arms crossed while the other boy stood alone, ignored. That photo went viral in seconds. A future king choosing loyalty over legacy, one commentator wrote. And the world agreed. The interview was meant to protect. It ended up destroying what little credibility remained. And as royal aides rushed to control the fallout, they missed one brewing reality. This was no longer about media optics. It was about trust, about identity, about who belonged and who never really did. As tensions boiled, Catherine finally did what many feared. She spoke out. And her words carried the weight of a future queen. With her voice trembling, Catherine broke the golden rule. She spoke openly about her daughter, her fears, and what had really been happening behind the gates of Buckingham. It wasn't planned, at least not in the way most royal speeches are. Catherine had been invited to deliver remarks at a youth mental health initiative, one she had championed for years. But this time, the topic was no longer abstract. It was deeply personal. And as she took the stage, the weight of silence she had upheld for months finally shattered. Without naming names, without pointing fingers, she delivered a message that was unmistakable. Every child, she said softly, her voice catching on the edge of emotion, deserves to be seen, heard, and respected, even inside a palace. The words struck like a lightning bolt across the nation. The audience held their breath. Cameras captured her expression, poised but pained. This wasn't just a mother speaking. It was a woman standing at the precipice of monarchy and motherhood, finally choosing the latter. She didn't mention Charlotte. She didn't need to. The heartbreak was in her voice. And behind her stood William, motionless, his face unreadable, his presence immovable. He didn't flinch, he didn't speak. But in that silence, there was solidarity. Speculation erupted within minutes. Was this the royal couple's way of breaking rank? Had the future king and queen just chosen a side and, in doing so, broken from the tradition of neutrality? The answer was in the headlines that followed. The press, emboldened by Catherine's bravery, began publishing reports long buried by the palace's media machine. Instances of Charlotte being cropped from official portraits. Events where she had been scheduled to appear but was pulled at the last moment. Stories of gifts promised by the queen that were redirected elsewhere. Each revelation chipped further at the illusion of unity the monarchy had spent years protecting. Camilla's response was silence. But this time, that silence screamed louder than any denial. There was no rebuttal, no carefully worded statement, just absence. And it was noticed. For a woman who had built her influence on quiet maneuvering, the public disappearance was deafening. Even her defenders struggled to explain her retreat. The narrative had shifted, and she was no longer in control of it. Meanwhile, social media turned Catherine's words into a rallying cry. Hashtags evolved into movements. Young women across the globe quoted her speech, framing it as a call to action not just for Charlotte, but for every child overshadowed by politics, tradition, or ego. It was no longer about protocol. It was about principle. And in that moment, the monarchy wasn't just fractured, it was exposed. But in the heart of this storm, King Charles made a sudden and risky decision to call an emergency royal summit. Inside Balmoral's private chamber, The most powerful royals gathered for one purpose: to determine how to handle the escalating war between two family lines. What followed was a vote no one expected. The room had hosted decades of royal decisions, marriages approved, scandals silenced, heirs positioned. But never had it seen stakes this personal, this volatile. Around the table sat King Charles, his expression drawn and fatigued. Princess Anne, stern and immovable. William, cold and composed. Camilla, pale but burning with emotion. And a small circle of trusted advisors who had watched the storm grow from whispers to war. The agenda was as clear as it was uncomfortable whether or not Camilla's grandchildren, most notably the one now at the center of national fury, should retain any association with royal duties, events, or visibility. The conversation began measured, almost cautious, as if each participant hoped someone else would make the first cut. But the civility didn't last. Anne was the first to speak with conviction. Her voice carried not just seniority, but decades of earned respect. "Legacy is earned," she said flatly, "not gifted." Her words landed with weight. It wasn't an attack, it was a reminder that titles, positions, and the public's trust were not accessories, they were responsibilities, and they could not be handed out like favors. Camilla snapped. For the first time, she didn't hold back. With her voice cracking under the pressure of months of tension, she demanded fairness. She spoke of her loyalty to the crown, the years she'd spent shielding the monarchy from ruin, the sacrifices she had made to stand where she now stood. Her grandson, she insisted, was young, human, and unfairly crucified. She looked to Charles for support, her eyes pleading for acknowledgement, but he looked away. William remained quiet until the final moment. Then, pulling out a folded paper from his coat, he read aloud not from a speech, but from a list, Charlotte's list. Charities she supported, speeches she gave, awards she quietly received, public duties completed without complaint. A profile not built on privilege, but on discipline. Every name, every date, was a brick laid against the argument that blood didn't matter. It did, but it wasn't the only thing that mattered. Dignity mattered more. The room fell silent, and then all eyes turned to Charles. The king sat in that moment longer than anyone expected, his hands clasped, his head slightly bowed. When he spoke, it was not with command, but with sadness. "The crown must reflect our values," he said quietly, and then he gave the answer. Camilla's family, from that moment forward, would no longer be invited to public royal engagements or official palace representation. Their connection to the monarchy would be personal but not public. Camilla didn't speak. She didn't argue. She simply stood, walked to the door, and left the chamber in silence. But before the dust could settle, Prince George made one final gesture that turned this into a defining moment of royal history. On the steps of Windsor Castle, surrounded by cameras and royal guards, George did something no young heir has ever done. He stood before the world and chose his sister over the crown. What was meant to be a simple youth initiative event transformed into history when George, poised beside his father, took a breath and went off script. With thousands watching live and millions more tuned in, he spoke plainly, fiercely. "Respect isn't inherited," he declared, voice unwavering. "It's earned, and my sister has earned it 100 times over." The crowd erupted. Applause surged like thunder across the castle grounds. Even palace staff were seen blinking back tears. Charlotte, standing nearby, clapped through teary eyes, her brother's words wrapping her in the armor the institution had denied her for far too long. The moment swept across social media within seconds. Headlines hailed him the People's Prince, while commentators called it the most authentic display of royal heart in decades. It was clear this wasn't just about Charlotte anymore. It was about the future of the monarchy. And at that moment, it looked radically different. Weeks later, a sealed scroll quietly left the king's private study. It bore the royal crest and the unmistakable glint of gold wax. It was a decree, signed by Charles himself, naming Charlotte as the future holder of the Queen Mother's patronage, one of the most symbolic honors in the royal family. Catherine and William were informed in private. George stood proudly at Charlotte's side during the official ceremony as she received the Queen's sapphire brooch, the same one Elizabeth had worn during key turning points of her reign. Camilla was nowhere in sight. Her seat, left visibly vacant, said more than words ever could. When the announcement was made, the crowd once again rose in applause. Cameras captured every frame, but this time, no one posed. It was real, raw, honest. The monarchy hadn't just changed, it had evolved. And as the press flooded timelines with the day's imagery, one truth stood above all. This was no longer just Charlotte's moment. It was the beginning of a new royal legacy, one defined not by bloodlines, but by bravery. And with that single moment, the monarchy stepped into a new chapter, led not by tradition, but by the courage of a brother who refused to stay silent. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.